Thank you, Mr. Strong. The chair now recognizes the Congresswoman from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all of our witnesses for testifying. We've heard a lot about this backlog, and I kind of want to drill down on it a little bit more. I think we're all very concerned about the backlog, making sure we get Taiwan what it needs. But I think it's important to be clear exactly where this backlog is coming from. You know, Daz Resnick, as you said, these sales pass through the State Department within a matter of days. And Dr. Ratner, as you said, one of the primary issues is that the industry is moving too slow. You know, one of the things that's really frustrating to me is that when we talk to industry about this, we hear time and again that what they need is a demand signal. But I think it's very clear that they have this demand signal, and they have had for years for a lot of these weapons that Taiwan is in line to get. And, you know, I think it'd be helpful, Deputy Assistant Secretary Resnick, if you could expand on what both you and Dr. Ratner have hinted about, and really what is needed from the industry to address this backlog, and how Congress can help make this happen.
Thank you so much for that question, and for really drilling down on what is needed from industry. It is true that industry needs a demand signal. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. We live in a capitalist society. That is truly important. We believe that we have sent that demand signal, and working with industry to be able to open new production lines, to be able to find ways to have either more hours for workers to be producing what we need. We have seen that with respect to F-16s. We have seen that with respect to Javelins, that industry is putting some of their own money. This needs to be widespread. And this is a point that our very senior leadership has made to industry about what is needed from them now.
Thank you. And Dr. Ratner, could you talk about how your department's working with industry to address this backlog?
Yeah, absolutely. We are likewise engaging with industry to try to understand how we can accelerate some of these timelines. We have had, as I mentioned, an FMS Tiger team within the department to look at this same set of issues, recommended embracing within the department a more data-driven approach, which would inform our engagement with industry again, and more senior level attention to this matter as well, among other issues. But I think the consistent demand signal and the health of the defense industrial base at the end of the day is where we're going to see improvements here. The process issues are really important, and we're focused on those, but ultimately the strength and health of the U.S. defense industrial base is going to be the key variable.
Thank you, and I just want to emphasize that we need the defense industrial base to step up themselves. They are part of our national security, and they benefit from our national security. And I think, especially when it comes to these specific weapons we're talking about for Taiwan, the demand signal has been there for many, many years. And the fact that they haven't made the investments, to me, is frankly neglectful. Really quickly, I just want to go to other assistance we could be giving Taiwan. We've talked a lot about the lethal assistance, but Dr. Ratner, in your testimony, you also talked about supporting the integration of Taiwan's military and civilian agencies on a range of issues like food, medical supplies, energy, infrastructure. Can you elaborate more on what this sort of non-lethal assistance looks like, and how your department and the State Department work together to make sure that this is all integrated?
Absolutely, and would be happy to provide much more detail in a classified setting. What I would say is one of the elements that is widely recognized as important for Taiwan is to have defense in depth. And as General McGee described earlier, the difficulties of actually invading the island, the defense of the island itself is incredibly important. And therein, the integration between Taiwan's civilian agencies and its military is a really important piece of that, as well as some of the institutional reforms that I described earlier as it relates to reserve reform and others. So there's absolutely a broad-based set of engagements around these issues, and I'd be happy to discuss them in more detail in another setting.
I can speak to a little bit, although it's a little bit outside of my purview. We're working closely with Taiwan's interagency to respond effectively in a crisis and build societal resilience. That includes ensuring sufficient water, energy, food, other critical resources to build preparedness. We're also working to support Taiwan's energy security, encouraging Taiwan's regulatory bodies to require a larger emergency energy stockpile to modernize its grid. Taiwan currently imports 98% of its energy resources, and so we are looking to help Taiwan to accelerate their deployment of renewable energy.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. The chair now recognizes the congressman from Guam, Mr. Moylan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. As Guam's sole member of Congress, this hearing is uniquely important to me. Many of the analysts who predict that China will invade Taiwan in the coming years also predict that China will launch preemptive strikes on Guam. To protect my home, I must advocate for stabilizing policies in the region and for an effective deterrence against CCP aggression. So my first question, Major General McGee and Assistant Secretary Ratner, I've been an advocate for Guam missile defense because the safety of my constituents is my focus. In line with unfunded priority requests from the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, I was able to increase funding levels for Guam missile defense in the House-passed NDAA. As I continue these efforts, I would like to ask what role a robust missile defense of Guam plays in deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan.
Well, Congressman, let me start off just by saying that as administration documents like the Missile Defense Review have made clear, Guam is part of the United States, and any missile attack on Guam or any other U.S. territory would be met with an appropriate response. That is in part why the Department is requesting $1.8 billion in the FY24 budget for the defense of Guam. This investment builds off of the $892 million appropriated by Congress in FY23, so nearly 100% increase. And the Department's efforts include active missile defenses, enhanced regional deterrence and defense posture, ally and partner assurance measures, and increased readiness for all the reasons that you described.
And sir, from the Joint Force perspective, certainly we have taken the lessons learned from Ukraine and are applying it to the way that we provide a comprehensive air defense against all threats. And of course, we've now seen it coming from multiples, not just, you know, it comes at every altitude, from drones all the way up to missiles. And so we are learning and tremendous amounts by watching that conflict, and I think we are continuing to get better at that.
Thank you. Ms. Resnick, I believe the strong relationship with our regional partners is the path towards stability in East Asia. Given their proximity to Taiwan and deep cultural ties to the United States, one extremely important partnership is the Philippines. In 2020, the Quad Plus dialogues included attendees such as Israel, Brazil, Vietnam, and New Zealand, alongside with the usual Quad members. We have the Philippines. Why have the Philippines not been included in the Quad Plus dialogues? And when will the State Department begin to include such important regional ally in our multilateral discussions?
The Philippines remains a very important partner to the United States. I will let Dr. Ratner discuss a little bit about our EDCA announcements, but let me just say that in recent years, we have included the Philippines in a number of regional engagements. We have also boosted our investment in security in the Philippines through foreign military financing, and we have launched a Philippine security sector assistance roadmap with the Philippines this year to be able to understand the threats that the Philippines faces, how those interact with so understanding the mutual threats, and so that we can work together to build a more effective security assistance framework for both countries.
I would just say strengthening and revitalizing our alliance with the Philippines has been one of the most important advances and achievements of this administration. We have, over the last year, announced new EDCA sites, the agreement that we have with the Philippines for U.S. access to Philippine facilities. As you know, we don't have permanent forces or bases there, but we do have access to their sites under a decade-old agreement, and we have increased the breadth of those sites over the past years to more strategic locations. We have also renewed bilateral maritime activity in the waters around the Philippines, which was an incredibly important development in terms of strengthening deterrence in the region. And we are integrating them with our closest allies and partners. I would just note that At the Shangri-La Dialogue this past year, for the first time ever, we held a defense ministerial between the defense ministers from the United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. And this kind of networking among our allies and partners, we believe, is really important to the progress we're making toward our common vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moylan. The chair now recognizes Ms. Takuda.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Over the past few years, we have seen a significant increase in bills and resolutions introduced here in Congress that would, in some form or another, politically and diplomatically elevate Taiwan's status. Unsurprisingly, the PRC has strongly protested these symbolic gestures as deeply destabilizing and threatening to the basic framework that the One China policy provides. There's also been some public commentary from experts about the risks posed by these types of symbolic gestures to Taiwan's security. For example, a recent Council on Foreign Relations task force recommended that the U.S. should avoid symbolic political and diplomatic gestures that provoke a Chinese response but do not meaningfully improve Taiwan's defense capabilities, resilience, or economic competitiveness. Ms. Resnick, how does the PRC interpret or perceive congressional initiatives that are symbolic in nature that suggest an elevation of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship into formal relations? And how do these symbolic gestures affect diplomatic efforts between the administration and the PRC as well?
What we are focused on is improving Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. Symbols of sovereignty are one way that we can do that, but we don't think that that is the most effective way for us to be able to do that. We would focus more on those areas that provide Taiwan with real security and not symbolic security.
Thank you. Major General McGee, how has the PRC used such symbolic gestures to escalate tensions, further alter the status quo, and cross-strait relations? How would you assess the impact of these symbolic gestures on deterring PRC aggression overall?
I'd like to defer to my policy friend who may have a better insight on that piece, frankly.
Look, maybe what I'll say here is part of the reason why this matters is because as we have spoken about at the hearing today, what we see is a trend of growing international attention among the international community to this issue. And the more countries around the world are committed to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, the less likely it is for Beijing to initiate military action because they understand what the repercussions would be on the international stage. As part of that, it is really important that the region see who the aggressor is here and who the one is here that is precipitating conflict and coercion. And therefore, what we see is day-to-day PRC military, economic, political pressure against Taiwan. And it's important that Taiwan itself, but also the United States, is not taking political actions that the Indo-Pacific region and the world see as leading to heightening tensions. So I thought the prompt of your question was really well put and support everything you said there.
Thank you. Maybe to take it to a slightly different direction, looking at our forward posture in the Western Pacific, I believe both Dr. Ratner and Major General McGee's written testimony emphasizes the importance of a forward-leaning U.S. force in the Western Pacific and a rigorous campaigning as part of our efforts to deter aggression against Taiwan and our allies and partners in the region. Dr. Ratner, perhaps this question is for you. As you know, we have addressed significant challenges with military infrastructure needs in Hawaii, where I am from, and that left unaddressed could complicate our ability to support and sustain increased efforts in our forward posture and campaigning in the Western Pacific. In your assessment, how important is it to your work and in reassuring our allies and partners in the region that we invest in sustaining and upgrading our military infrastructure?
Our forward posture and presence in the region, including in Hawaii, is fundamentally important to our defense position in the region. It's fundamentally important to deterrence, and it's an area where this administration has been incredibly focused and frankly made really historic advances over the past year.
Thank you. And as you know, Dr. Ratner, we are close to finalizing renegotiations of the compacts of free association with Palau, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. How critical is it that Congress expeditiously approve these agreements in terms of our forward posture in the Western Pacific? And as we approach the end of the fiscal year, why is it so important that Congress provide funding for these countries under a continuing resolution? If we fail to act, do we actually provide the PRC with a window of opportunity, even a temporary one, to fill the void and complicate a very strategic relationship?
I would just say the compact states and the COFA agreement is incredibly important for our position in the region, as you described, and we look forward to working with Congress to find a solution to sustain those agreements.
And clearly, funding and support for this now and going forward is absolutely critical to maintain the relationship and not provide the PRC with any opportunity to come and fill the gap.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Takuda. The chair now recognizes the congressman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Xi Jinping has repeatedly and publicly stated that he's willing to use force to unify China and bring Taiwan, as he says, back under control in one nation. I find that comment interesting because the Communist Chinese have never ruled in Taiwan, and I just think that's a historical note to mention. He's called it a natural requirement and for them to be reunited, in stating that the use of force is their policy, preparing for a contingency to unify Taiwan by force if perceived as necessary by Beijing. And then former Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral Philip Davidson stated in 2021, when talking about China's potential for invading Taiwan, said, and I quote, "I think the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years." And that means, of course, by 2027. Now, while nobody wants war, what is the best way to prevent it? And you have to take great care when you talk about, when you use comparisons to the Nazis or Hitler and things like that, because it's overused. But I think it is instructive to listen to what dictators say. In January of '39, Hitler gave a speech and he outlined two goals. He wanted war and he wanted to annihilate the Jewish race in Europe. And then, of course, in September that year, he went ahead and tried to accomplish both objectives. And then in 2021, in July, Vladimir Putin released an essay, and it was on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And he went on to say, essentially, that they're not like brothers, they share the same soul, which, of course, is rather chilling. And then 7 months later, he claimed he was going to liberate and denazify Ukraine. So I want to offer these examples, not to, of course, stoke fears, but to illustrate that we need to listen to what dictators are saying. And we can all hope for the best, but we need to prepare for the worst. And I'm a little afraid that we're not necessarily maybe preparing for the worst. So Dr. Ratner, if you could, and I'm being not facetious here, but serious, I don't know what the Biden administration policy is vis-a-vis Taiwan and a potential Chinese attack. Will we defend Taiwan if attacked? Is that the policy?
The policy, Congressman, is one of strategic ambiguity.
Okay.
And has been for decades, and we believe that remains most important to maintain that status quo in our policy. We are clear-eyed about the PRC
I apologize.
threat.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but we just have very limited time. And I wanted to get to your point in your answer about strategic ambiguity. I think that was an okay policy when China didn't have the capability to invade Taiwan successfully, which clearly years ago they had not the capability to do so. They have it now. So I would argue that, well, let me ask you this question. Do you think Xi Jinping is more likely than not to invade Taiwan if there were two circumstances? If the United States president, whoever it was, said, we will defend Taiwan. That's scenario A. If attacked by China, the Chinese communists. Or we maintain strategic ambiguity. Which, if you are sitting in a think tank or you're in the war room at the White House, what do you think is more likely?
I think the effects of changing our policy to one of strategic clarity away from strategic ambiguity would not strengthen deterrence by the United States. I think it would increase political tensions and make conflict more likely, and I think it would cause us to lose the support of our allies and partners, as we described earlier.
Okay. I respectfully disagree. I think you have to do it in the right way. We're not really changing the political policy at all. We're not saying that we support Taiwanese independence, because I do think in what you just said that would exacerbate the issue. All we're saying is if China uses force, then we'll defend Taiwan. I would argue that it's going to increase deterrence because deterrence work. We know what dictators and authoritarians do. They avoid strength and they attack weakness. If he thinks he can grab it, let me ask you this. If Xi thought he could grab Taiwan, have 6 months maybe of economic sanctions, and then the world, much like Crimea happened with Putin, do you think he'd do it?
When we think about deterrence, what we think about is ensuring that he does not believe he could exact aggression against Taiwan at acceptable cost.
So but do you think then if he did what Putin did, Putin successfully grabbed Crimea? I think we'd all agree with that. Do you think if Xi could follow that model, he would do it?
I guess it depends what you mean by the Putin model. If
the world
Xi Jinping
largely
if
forgot
Xi
about what
Jinping
happened.
believed by
I mean,
invading,
we normalized in 6 to 12 months, and everybody went back to the way they were living. That's what I mean.
Look, I don't want to get into hypotheticals. What I would say is I understand the questions that you're asking, and it is at the heart of how we think about deterrence and ensuring that Xi Jinping does not believe he can do that at acceptable cost. And we think today that is the case, and that's why we say deterrence is real and strong. That's why we say we do not think an invasion is imminent or inevitable, and we are doing more than ever to keep it that way.
I'm
Congressman's time is
I'm afraid that
expired.
he may think a very short order that it is acceptable.
The
Thank
chair
you,
now.
Madam Chair.
The chair now recognizes the Congresswoman from Virginia, Congresswoman McClellan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. A key support mechanism for our military alliances in the Pacific is a robust diplomatic presence. Yet we face the very real prospect of severe cuts to the state and foreign operations budget that funds the State Department, USAID, and other diplomatic programs. How would significant cuts to the international affairs budget complicate efforts to maintain alliances and ensure we are able to present a united front against political aggression by the Chinese government against Taiwan?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. We have used the diplomatic budget effectively throughout the Indo-Pacific to be able to shore up alliances and partnerships where it comes to reimagining our alliances and partnerships with Japan, with Vietnam, with Korea, with Taiwan, of course, with the Philippines. If there are cuts to the state foreign ops budget, and I can speak from the perspective of the IMED account, our peacekeeping operations account, and our foreign military financing. Because these budgets are so heavily earmarked, we have very little flexibility. If there were cuts, what we would have to do is look at anything that isn't earmarked and put it on the cutting room floor. There is no earmark for Taiwan. There are very few earmarks in the Indo-Pacific, and so we would be looking at keeping status quo, which is that 70% of the FMF budget is in the Middle East. We cannot afford to do that.
Thank you. Secretary Ratner or Secretary Resnick, the United States, Japan, and South Korea recently concluded a summit that made progress on a number of fronts to expand trilateral collaboration. Can you elaborate on how we are expanding collaboration with our trilateral allies, particularly the joint military industrial base capacity expansion and specialization, and what areas we are looking to further expand coordination in the future?
Sure, I'm happy to start to say that the leader-level meeting that President Biden hosted at Camp David truly was historic in terms of bringing together two of our closest allies around the world, Japan and South Korea, and I think there's no question that all three of those countries are more secure when we are all working more closely together. During that summit, there were two particular announcements that were made as it relates to military cooperation. One was to advance a program on data sharing for early missile warning data between the three countries, particularly related to the North Korea threat. We're making progress on that and hope to have that in place by the end of this calendar year. And secondarily, in addition, to be developing a more regularized program of trilateral military exercises and cooperation. That's also under development, and we think this is a really positive trend, and it's one that is not just happening in Northeast Asia. I should say that we are working increasingly in combination with our allies and partners, Japan, Australia, and the United States, also as a trilateral configuration, are engaging in new and unprecedented forms of military cooperation, and we think this is really important for deterrence and for regional security.
Thank you. One of the alarming but not unexpected dynamics of Russia's war with Ukraine has been the tendency of African nations to remain uninvolved or continue to engage with Russia despite its gruesome war crimes, which I would characterize as a colonial war of aggression. Would we expect a similar dynamic to play out in a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? And how are we working to increase engagement with our African partners that would make them less likely to side with China or continue to treat China normally should it move aggressively toward Taiwan?
Thanks for that question. And this is something that we work on every day globally, but including in Africa, to make the case for the rules-based international order and how Africa especially can benefit from it. We have a lot of work to do here, and especially in the context of Wagner operations in Africa, we have a lot of work to do in order to remain competitive. That is something that we have started in a number of countries, and we're happy to come back and brief you in a different environment. We understand that there are some lessons learned from these kind of conversations that could apply in a Taiwan scenario, and we'll continue to work those relationships.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the congressman from Georgia, Dr. McCormick.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for coming here today and testifying. I think everybody in this room agrees that Taiwan is extremely important to us strategically. It's the linchpin of the first island of the chain, and as for now, we obviously have a lot of critical things going on in the area. I'm worried about the technologies that it contains as far as we really maintain the leader in AI industry, but where the AI chips are produced is an island that entirely produces 100% of our AI chips. My concern is if China does what it says it's going to do, and I'll take them for their face of their word, by 2027, and we don't have a plant up here to take over that, what capabilities, and I'll direct this to you, Major General McGee, what capabilities or what kind of agreement do we have with the Taiwanese in denying Chinese access to that AI production in the case of an invasion, or our access to that same production? Because without AI, of course, being the leading technology of our day, matter of fact, of any day, that will affect our economy and our ability to produce the next leading edge of technology. How do we keep them from access or obtaining that and keeping us from denying that access?
So I appreciate that question. I think export control, though, might be more of a Department of State question.
I'm actually talking in the case of an invasion, so actually a war. If they do what they say, by force, try to take Taiwan, and you can defer this question, but it goes back to a conflict where Taiwan and China are in conflict. How do we maintain our access to a hard value asset, which we cannot produce ourselves, and we're 2 years away from it, even if we do groundbreaking now, and how do we deny the Chinese from obtaining that same hard asset in a time of war?
I'd be happy to discuss that in another setting, but would say, of course, the broader question of how do we maintain our advantages in peacetime, and then how do we maintain resilience or build resilience into crisis and conflict is something we absolutely are looking at in terms of trying to increase our supply chain resiliency of our defense industrial base and support programs with domestic and alternative materials as well as innovative manufacturing. So you're identifying an important challenge. And we're laser focused on it, and would be happy to follow up in a different setting.
Okay, so we'll put the war stuff on the table because I get that. I'm a military guy. So let's talk peacetime. One of the things I think is great, maybe in a sort of strange way, is the Arunachal region of India, which is disputed by China, which has about 300,000 troops on the border there disputing that. That's just per side. So you have 600,000 troops right there in that region, which I think they have to rotate out every 3 months or so because the altitude is so high, which is a great deterrence when you talk about what China has to face in that region, which I think is great to have great strategic allies in that area. When we talk about deterrence, obviously we did a horrible job of deterring Russia from invading Ukraine. We knew he'd talked about it. Nobody took it at face value. Then he did it. We didn't do a good job. We weren't strong enough to deter them from doing that. What are we doing deterrence-wise other than saying we're investing in the military, we have great training, we have great assets, but what are we doing to truly make China think second thoughts other than supporting Ukraine, which I think is a great deterrence, saying, you know, we are committed to our friends. But what other things are we bringing to the table that make China go, I really don't want any part of that, rather than what we just discussed where we can't really give a good answer as far as what do we do when they actually invade?
Maybe I'll start and ask General McGee to build upon the question. I mean, look, we have a national defense strategy that has informed a budget that is focused on the capabilities that we need to deter and prevail if necessary against the PRC. For the first time, a strategy focused on the PRC as the primary challenge, and our budget request reflects that. So we are investing in the capabilities we need. Joint Staff has been working very concertedly on the joint warfighting concept and operational concepts that are designed to overcome operational problems that the PRC is trying to present. So it's capabilities and concepts. We are building out our forward defense perimeter in the Indo-Pacific and have made really important gains over the last year in Japan, in the Philippines, in Australia, in Papua New Guinea, such that we are forward in the region, and we are strengthening our alliances and partnerships, including in ways that are relevant to potential China-related contingencies.
And I know I'm out of time, so I'll just reinforce how important the Quad is, how important our alliances and strategic alliances are, and also our investment in the area, not just in what we do, because we don't like nuclear powers to go against each other, but investment in other strategically important allies in the region. That's why we do what we do. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Congresswoman from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you. First, I want to thank all of you for your hard work during these really troubling times as we face a variety of complex pressures around the world. As a member of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party, we know that sufficient basing, supply chains, logistics efforts in the Indo-PACOM are critically important, but also the role of ensuring that economic factors at play are another critical and sometimes as important role as we, the CCP, and our global partners react to the Taiwanese contingency. So I secured in this year's NDAA an amendment to have DoD analyze where they can better partner with the Commerce Department so we can ensure that economic and business factors are thought of as we game plan our Indo-Pacific efforts and assess consequences of our actions. To each of you, can you give a quick overview of your current efforts with Commerce and where you might see further partnerships?
I can say that from a State Department perspective, one of the things that we work on, and again, this is a little bit outside of my area in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, but we work on responding to economic coercion, and we work with the interagency on doing that. That is both in the Russia context and in the PRC context. Conducting tabletop exercises with respect to economic coercion and making sure that we're able to shore up our allies and partners if they are victims of that kind of economic coercion.
And the Department of Defense works closely with Commerce as well as Treasury and other economic agencies at the intersection of military and economic affairs. We work closely with them on export controls that are related to technology competition with the PRC relevant to PLA modernization. We worked with the Commerce Department and, of course, the Treasury Department on the new policy on outbound investment screening and the executive order on that new process. And we continue to work with the Commerce Department as well as interagency partners on potential response options for both crisis and conflict. So we see them as an integral partner in these scenarios and are continuing to work with them closely.
Ma'am, as you know, this is a complicated and challenging problem, and it needs a whole government approach. As a member, as the Joint Staff, we are fully engaged in the interagency process, and we know that Commerce always has a really important role and a voice in all of those discussions and follow-on actions.
Well, I'm heartened to hear your responses because, as you know, we work a lot on the Armed Services Committee to make sure that we are implementing all the deterrent military capabilities we can, but of course the economic piece is a critical part of that deterrence as well. And as we go forward, how can we as a nation with our critical partner in Taiwan continue to improve interoperability with the Taiwanese? What additional resources can Congress provide to ensure we effectively strengthen our relationship to, again, bolster deterrence?
I think Congress has taken great steps to help increase the military assistance with presidential authorization. I think, as we mentioned here, an appropriation would be tremendously helpful with that as well, as opposed to just an authorization. And I think, as I had mentioned earlier, I think where assistance can be provided to help with Taiwan is their concept of a joint defense in order to defend that island nation from in an air threat, a sea threat, cyber, and space. And that's complicated and difficult within military operations, and I think that's an area of potential great assistance.
From a State Department perspective, we agree that fully funding the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act for foreign military financing would be really useful. That would allow things to get on contract more quickly. But in the meantime, to provide an interim solution as we wait for industry to provide Taiwan with what it needs. Having backfill, just to reiterate Dr. Ratner's point, having backfill, appropriating backfill for presidential drawdown authority to allow the Defense Department to take from its own stocks, that provides the interim solution until industry is able to provide something to Taiwan.
Well, thank you all again, and can I say thank you as well to the State Department for coming to this hearing. We don't always have you here, and hearing from sort of the whole of government is very, very helpful. So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the congressman from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I want to start out by going to a question that was posed moments ago, Ms. Resnick, with regards to the approval process. As you know, the DDTC has an actual DDTC response that you can track from your submittals on a DSP-83 to a DSP-5. And I can tell you that your comment that it's 48 hours in approval couldn't be further from the truth. I've watched where multiple times the DSP-5 was held up within the DDTC, and in some cases, they are returned without approval or returned without any type of response, negative or positive, without any actual understanding of why, even when the National Security Council and others have approved it. I also noted that you said about wanting to put the blame on industry, but the reality is that when there's no confidence in industry that the approval is going to come out, and knowing the prolonged timeline in which we submit a proposal, which is supposed to get to the LCTA BAFO, this timeline could be a year, 2 years, which is why I've been very much advocating on procurement reform to ensure that we could also expedite these processes. But again, the idea that it would take industry long to purge lines to ensure that the previous contract didn't actually have any overlapping materials to ensure that it was a legitimate new cost doesn't take industry that long, and I've seen where they've done it. They like to try and add that it costs more than it really does, and I know how they fluff the things on this. And they claim that they use GAAP, our generally accepted accounting principles, but we know how that's been abused. But I want to go back to outcome, not process. The OEM for F-16 parts, and we know we just had roughly 103 Chinese aircraft that had basically incurred a little bit of that on-the-line kind of preemptive response that allowed the Taiwanese having to spin up. Every time they cycle that aircraft for the F-16, that leads to a closer point in which they're actually going to say, okay, well, last time that we did this exercise, we saw a 10% increase in how many people responded than now. That must mean that they don't have the necessary parts. So it gives the Chinese also an intelligence capability to gather whether or not we're responding in a timely manner and whether or not that their ability to ramp up to be able to deter this. So again, providing very strategic military information. What can we do to increase the approvals? not the amount of funding, not whether it's an FMS, FMF, or a DCS contract, which is even better for the United States economy, but to speed up the actual process, because I can tell you, ma'am, it is not 48-hour approvals.
First of all, Mr. Mills, thank you for your leadership on this and for bringing up these very important issues. Highly advanced defense articles, as you know, must go through an interagency clearance process that the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls manages. So that goes through several different stakeholders in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. It also goes through other stakeholders within the State Department and within DoD. Within the Pentagon. We are expediting arms sales to Taiwan as quickly as possible. We approve, as I said, we approve most FMS cases to Taiwan within 48 hours. Those are the items that are under congressional threshold. Industrial production capacity and not states' review process is what is holding us back at this point. With respect to DDTC timelines, I understand that they may be different than FMS timelines, and you probably know best. But understanding from an outcome perspective, what we are trying to do here is improve those timelines regardless of where the choke points are.
Well, I can tell you that I'm committed to try and work with you, your team, the DDTC, to ensure that we actually do get the necessary reform to support industry and support upcoming response. You know, having run in multiple, defense companies in my past, I can tell you my experience, whether it was with a DSP-5, DSP-83, dealing with ATF Form 2, Form 9s, you name it, we know the overregulations. But I do want to ensure that we're able to respond. And I want to comment on something that some of my colleagues have talked about. They keep talking about how we handle Ukraine determines the outcome of Taiwan, and I slightly disagree with this. And I disagree with this because what we don't recognize is the non-kinetic economic and resource supply chain capabilities that China has really tried to bolster in an effort to try and prevent America from having. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative is a good point where they try to look at Eurasian expansion. They look at the domination of Africa and Oceania to cut off Western Hemisphere supply chain while simultaneously utilizing OPEC, WHO, WF, and others as a way to attack the U.S. dollar as a global currency. And we've seen this. So we're not focusing in enough, in my opinion, on the non-kinetic elements of influence, messaging, as well as for the economic warfare of things. And so it's troubling when Joe Biden at the G20 summit talks about how much he wants China's economy to grow while not giving a whole lot of confidence to our abilities to support developing nations. And my final thing, and I know I'm out of time, Madam Chair, but my final thing is that we kept saying that we don't want to send the message that we're being unreliable. Well, we lost that fight 2 years ago when we walked out of Afghanistan. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the congressman from Texas, Mr. Vesey.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I want to thank the panel for being here today. I wanted to ask about, given Xi's statements about reunification with Taiwan, how should we interpret the CCP's commitment to peaceful reunification while also not renouncing the use of force? And was hoping that y'all had an assessment on those statements that he made.
I would just say I think what he has stated is fairly clear. I think there would be there's a preference for peaceful unification, but the PRC has not renounced its willingness to use force to achieve that aim if it deems necessary and if it believes it can do so at acceptable cost.
And also, how does the Department of Defense assess the progress of the People's Liberation Army Modernization Program as outlined in the China Military Power Report and its implications for Taiwan? General?
I think we've seen an expansion of their capabilities, really sort of a broad-based. We think many of those capabilities would enhance their ability to launch a cross-strait invasion, but that does not mean that would be an easy operational challenge. I still want to highlight the significant operational difficulties for China to be able to conduct that operation.
I know that CIA Director Burns mentioned that Xi instructed the PLA to be ready for a successful invasion by 2027. And I wanted to sort of couple that with something that happened back in the 90s under President Clinton's administration, the third Taiwan Strait crisis. I know that particular incident that took place back in the 90s, that was a really big influence, on the Chinese as far as the way that they see themselves projected in the region as far as ocean power is concerned. Could you sort of talk a little bit about the significance of that and how maybe that plays a role in how the Chinese think today?
Look, I think what I would say, without getting into their own psychology, what I would say is that we are clear-eyed about the PRC challenge. The National Defense Strategy identifies the PRC as the department's top pacing challenge, and the National Security Strategy describes the PRC as the only country with the will and increasingly the capability to refashion the international community or the international order in line with its authoritarian ambitions. So we are aware of what their preferences are, what they're trying to achieve. However, what we are trying to do is ensure that they cannot achieve those aims at acceptable cost.
Yeah. Also wanted to ask you, we know that the Chinese have been, vehemently opposed to any sort of upgrades on F-16s or new F-16s there to Taiwan. If there were an invasion, how helpful would F-16s actually be for Taiwan? Would they play a significant role? I mean, obviously the Chinese military operation is much more larger and much more expansive than that of the Taiwanese. Would those planes be a help to Taiwan, particularly when there's a new generation of plane out?
We've notified a number of cases during this administration to support Taiwan's F-16 program, which we understand is very useful in defending Taiwan's airspace, particularly with some of the gray zone activities. I can say that this is something that we will continue to support, and we understand that Taiwan finds their F-16s valuable.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, and I just wanted to thank our witnesses for taking time. I know you've been here for a good portion of your day, so we're going to wrap up this committee meeting. I just have a few last questions for you guys. So I had the privilege of traveling with Congressman Whitman last month to Southeast Asia. We went to Japan, the Philippines, and to Taiwan, and could see kind of up close just what is going on in that part of the world. One of the places we went was to Kadena Air Base, and the complaints we heard were about infrastructure and their inability to continue to do their very tip of the spear mission without some infrastructure improvements and some quality of life upgrades. Also talking to the Marines in Okinawa just about housing. I know that we're challenged in even the healthcare department. We're having our military members and their families being seen off base. So we also learned, though, that our allied countries there are very invested in our partnership. So we know that Japan is putting in 2% of their GDP, the highest ever, into their defense budget. We know that Taiwan's is about 2.7, I think, % of their GDP. So we're seeing them put their money where their mouths are. So I guess my ask and my request is, are we also asking them to invest in some infrastructure for us in our base? We're happy to be there, happy to partner and be allies with our friends, but we need some assistance here. Our defense budget is already challenged. Those are parts of the world that don't have representatives that can fight for some of their base needs and infrastructure needs. So is that in the works? Are our allies willing partners in helping in our military investment?
Well, thank you for all of those comments. I was actually just yesterday engaging with General Rupp, Commander of U.S. Forces Japan, and General Skolenka, the Deputy Commander out at Indo-Pacific, on quality of life issues associated with our forces in Japan. It's incredibly important for the Department and the Secretary, and we will continue to do whatever we can to address some of those issues that you described. I have also been encouraged, as you have, by the approach that our allies and partners have taken. You mentioned Taiwan increasing its defense budget. We're very encouraged by that. We've seen Japan set on course to double its defense budget over the next 5 years. The Philippines is also investing in new ways, and the Australians absolutely investing in their own military. And we think that's important for their own contributions to regional security. It increases their ability to contribute to our alliance in new ways as we think about integrating them in roles and missions. And in a number of instances, they are also contributing to infrastructure and supporting our forward presence. So we think that's really important, and I think the role of our allies and partners is key to our success here.
Good. I just asked that we continue to prioritize that as well, in addition to warfighting. And then another question posed to us in Japan was the issue of ship repair. And I represent a district that has a large ship repair industry in Virginia, and that often complains they don't have enough business, and they, it's a lot of factors. We have not enough ships. I wish we had more, but the Japanese want to be more involved. I want to make sure we're repairing ships, as quickly as possible. God forbid there's a conflict, we're going to need to repair ships closer to where the action is. So how can we ensure that we're being protective of our ship repair industry while prioritizing the speed and just capabilities we have in Southeast Asia and being inclusive of Japan?
I'm happy to take that question for the record. I understand there's a lot of factors here, including some of the domestic factors, and getting that balance right about our own domestic industrial capability here associated with ship repair, while also thinking about what contributions our allies and partners can make and what the operational requirements might be is a really important question. I understand there are conversations underway now between the administration and Congress about some of these issues, and look forward to engaging on them going forward.
Good, thank you. And then they also brought up the issue of cognitive warfare, and we were there during Fukushima when there was some environmental groups and there was some interference from China. They had a lot of bad press. They utilize cyber technology, the media, to be influential to the Japanese people, which right now are overwhelmingly supportive of our alliance and our relationship, the relationship we have with Japan. But just thinking forward, are we cooperating and being supportive of them on that cognitive warfare front as well? And I think it's an important thing that we sometimes overlook, but just wanted to hear how we're prioritizing that too.
Congresswoman, we are throughout the region, including in Japan, and we do. I think what you've described is a really good example of what we see throughout the Indo-Pacific in terms of PRC propaganda and information operations and disinformation. We've seen it around the Fukushima issue. We've seen it throughout Taiwan in a number of ways, in the Philippines as well, in Australia and elsewhere, as the PRC is trying to undermine our alliances and undermine the support for political leaders who want to work with the United States. We're working with these partners in terms of their own cyber capabilities, their own cyber hygiene, as well as our own demands that we do as much as we can to be transparent about the information we have about what the PRC is doing, and we'll continue to be focused on that.
Good, thank you very much. My time has expired. So I thank our witnesses for being here and our members for their participation, and the committee now stands adjourned. Thank you.